we decided together that I will talk about Putnam for several reasons. The first one is that, okay, Putnam is interesting in himself and he changes mind many times. He has new ideas, so this is good to evaluate. But also, we have a kind of a new network, including our universities, that is interested in realism. So I want to say something, using Putnam as a reason to discuss these issues. Yesterday I said something that I will repeat briefly about two forms of naturalism that I think are important nowadays. I would say that now Putnam is now both a naturalist of a sort that we'll see and a realist of a sort that we'll see. After, now he says, having been for 15 years, 76 to 90, an anti-realist. He called himself an internal realist that period, but now he recognizes that that period was pure anti-realism. Okay, so this is, we'll see more. Okay, so briefly, I'm describing two forms of naturalism. Yesterday I used the word ontology instead of metaphysics. I won't do this today because for reasons I will say later, Putnam is not very happy with the word in itself. So I will say more. So, but anyway, that's the main form of naturalism nowadays, starting more or less with Putnam, and with Quine. And so, can you read? Because if you can't read, Peter. Peter has very good classes, so can read. I don't know about the other people, but let's assume you read, and then you read that this is the idea that the world consists of nothing but the entities to which successful scientific explanations commit us to. So the idea is that science defines our ontology, but I repeat, I don't want to use the word too much here. From an epistemological point of view, if you take an explanation, either this explanation is a scientific explanation or is reducible to a scientific explanation, at least in principle. Otherwise, it's not a good explanation. That's the idea. Metaphilosophically, famously, philosophy has to be continuous with science. That's the mainstream naturalism. And it's not the one that Putnam sympathizes with. Also, the main problem of this kind of naturalism, the one that really sets the agenda for philosophers who have this idea, by this conception, is the so-called placement problem. So the idea how to deal with the controversial features of the world. So norms and values, intentionality, phenomenology, mathematical truths, all the things or ideas or properties that don't seem to fit the scientific view of the world, at least prima facie. The idea is to show that they do in some way or that they are just fictions. That's more or less what happens in this field, scientific naturalism. The other one, the three main forms of answers to these questions are reductionism. So these entities can be reduced, even if they appear to be differently reducible, they only appear to be reducible. Perhaps you can reduce them to kosher scientific entities, or you can eliminate them and show how you can go without them. Or, this is an interesting view, people say, look, for example, Colin McGinn or Noam Chomsky, or in some respect Thomas Nagel, Peter Weinberger, there are things that are very important for us: free will, consciousness, intentionality. But these things cannot be really reduced to any scientific notion. But they can't be eliminated either, because we can't do without them. So they are indispensable. So this is a mystery. The answer is out there in some way, because they are naturalists, but they think that we won't ever find a solution. I take Mysterianism as a reduction, a very honest reduction of this view, especially when they say, that you have to, ontology and epistemology are being, metaphysics and epistemology have to coincide with what the sciences tell us about the world. The real result is Mysterianism in many important fields, and I don't think this is a very good position. So I prefer to give up scientific naturalism and I personally, and Putnam does the same, accept this view. So the idea here is that some real non-supernatural features of the world cannot be accounted for by science. So look, they are not accounted by science, but they are not non-supernatural. Okay? So it's not that people in this field believe that free will, for example, give an example, right, is accountable by science, but they don't think there are agents in the tradition, the metaphysical tradition, that, you know, escape the laws of causation in a mysterious way. Famously, Roderick Chisholm proposed this solution to the free will problem. We are causa sui, in a way that is totally incompatible with what science tells us about the world. That's not a kind of solution that's acceptable for this school. Epistemology, there are legitimate forms of understanding that, for what we know, are neither reducible to the empirical forms of understanding nor supernatural. For example, a priori reasoning, artistic understanding, etc. We talked about this yesterday. There is nothing that a liberal naturalism is against. It's not really against reductions. Personally, I'm happy when some item is reduced to a scientific item, that, you know, an item that is not really prima facie not scientific. That's okay, that's good. The only problem, I'm not a reductionist. I don't have the ideology that this has to happen for everything that is relevant. I don't think this I think is just ideology. And as to the meta-philosophy, for some of its features, philosophy is not continued with science, even if it should not be in conflict with it. The problem here is, what happens if there is a conflict between philosophy and science? For a liberal naturalist, this has to be solved, but there are different ideas about this, how this should be done. We'll see what Patton says. Okay, so this is, I think, Patton, his views about these three things, so metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy. As to several theses in metaphysics and he endorses now, I think are interesting. So he's a scientific realist. He believes that the unobservable theoretical entities of science are real. So atoms are out there. They are not. He refuses the instrumentalistic, conventionalist interpretations of science. Okay. So the entities postulated by our best theories are out there, even if we can't directly perceive them. That's the idea. So scientific realism. What is interesting from a historical point of view, that Patton argues, and I think he's right, that even if the many critics were wrong about this, he was always a scientific realist. He was an anti-realist about semantics, but he was always a realist about mathematical entities. Okay? It's different for mathematical statements, so well, I'll see more. Because there he believes that mathematical statements are, of course, true or false. He's not a fictionalist about mathematics. He's not like Hartfield, who thinks that mathematical statements are not true. They are true, but not because they refer to special entities. That's his view now. So he's not an ontological realist as to mathematics, even if he's a semantic realist about mathematics. Okay? Now he rejects, he still rejects as he did when he was a scientific, an internal realist. He rejects metaphysical realism. So this is the idea that the world is composed by exactly one domain of individuals and one domain of properties attributed to those individuals. Okay? He refuses this. So he's a pluralist. Pluralist as to the question of realism. And so he refuses the idea that there is one world out there that can be described in exactly one way. Of course, I'll say more about this. So he's a pluralist. Reality is composed of many mutually irreducible levels. That could be, you were saying something similar, I think, yesterday, perhaps. And also now he rejects internal realism. You know, the idea that he identified he refused the idea that truth. He identified truth with assurability in ideal conditions, and now truth can be bigger than, stronger than what we can really know. That's the idea. He accepts this now, and an example he gives is actually very good and very convincing. The statement, there is no life in the universe besides the life that there is on the earth. He says, if this is true, we are, there are good reasons to think that we will never prove it. Okay? So if there is no other life in the universe, if there is life, we can prove it. But if there is no life, and the statement is there is no life, this cannot ever be proved by us. So that's a good reason to think that there are true statements that are unknowable by us or by anybody finite being even in a very good epistemic condition. And then it's interesting, this is what it does for, I said, for mathematics and ethics. There can be kind of an objectivity. Our sentences, our judgments in mathematics and ethics can be true or false, but not because there are special truth makers. There are no special ethical or mathematical entities. And I would say more. Okay, as to epistemology, is a pluralist in epistemology. As I said, there are many cognitively non-equivalent and mutually irreducible conceptual schemes that have to be used to account for reality. This clearly comes from pragmatism. Okay? So the idea that, for example, you can describe a situation in physical terms. A typical example is a chair. You can describe a chair in physical terms. You can describe a chair as a piece of furniture, or you can describe it in geometrical terms. So these are different and irreducible to each other, and actually all useful. It says, we employ many different kinds of discourses. Discourses subject to different standards and possessing different sorts of applications. So this is the idea, pluralism in epistemology. And Pack-Quine, there is not such a thing as a first-grade conceptual system. That's a crucial point. It's not true that physics is the basic conceptual system that roots everything about knowledge, okay? It's not true. It's not that the description of the chair as a piece of furniture with all the connective vocabulary is less important or reducible to the physical description. Okay, then to what is philosophy. He thinks that philosophy has two phases. One is the theoretical phase, and the other the moral phase. So one is, this is a famous quotation from Sellers. So philosophy has to clarify what we think we know and work out how we see that all things happens together, okay? So to understand how the world is. But also a moral phase, which interrogates our lives and our cultures as they have been up to now, and which challenge us to reform both. So the idea is that this is about the normativity that is connected with our lives, and this is about how the world is done. This is of course different from the way Quine thought of philosophy. There was no moral phase there. That's, so he refuses the Quine's idea, no, he accepts Quine's idea that there is no first philosophy. In the sense that philosophy that judges the epistemic claims of the sciences. There is not such a thing. But there is no second philosophy either. The term second philosophy comes from Penelope Medi, who thinks that philosophy is subordinate to the sciences. So Medi, that's not her term, but I think it can be said, thinks that there is scientia prima. So not for prima philosophia, but scientia prima. And Patton thinks that's not true. There is kind of a paradigmatic relationship between philosophy and science. Okay, now, compatibility, as I said, between philosophy and science is a methodological constraint. So, and this is the point. But he would refuse, actually. I know he refuses, and I think he's right. And a point that is interesting, but I think is too strong, that was made by Hugh Price. Hugh Price wrote that in case of conflict, philosophy has to defer to the unique authority of the natural sciences. I think that this is a little too strong. Also because he assumes that, philosophy is on one side and science is on the other side. Actually, if you look at philosophy of science, sometimes when you look at quantum mechanics, really they are interconnected. So think about if you judge the epistemic virtues or philosophical theories, or cases like the introduction of the infinitesimal mathematics, how do you say in English? Infinitesimal calculus. That was a big philosophical debate, right? Between Leibniz, Newton, and the others. That was really philosophical about what it meant to have particles of the entities that are so small that you can always have smaller. So smaller, you can always have something that is smaller of the smallest thing you can imagine. So that was a big philosophical debate besides being scientific. Or even discussions about quantum mechanics or the theory of relativity are intrinsically philosophical. Not to say what happened when Galileo studied modern science. But there was a lot of philosophy there. In no sense, I think, really philosophy deferred to the authority of the natural sciences. I think that this is just ideology. I don't think it works that way. And finally, Hilary Putnam thinks that nowadays, especially in the analytic field, that of course preferable for many reasons, but there is a defect that, you know, philosophy is generally divided in unrelated fields. Now perhaps it's changing. This is changing because of the, you know, many cognitive studies, and people tend to relate things much more. But traditionally, who did philosophy of language didn't care about ethics and so on, and that was a little too strong in his opinion, because you can have inputs, theoretical inputs in different fields using, you know, if you try to do them together. Okay, now that's what he says about ethics. He says similar things about mathematics, I said. I think that this is particularly interesting, to understand what he says compared with the positions in ethics nowadays in the debate. Okay, he has a specific version of realism. I repeat, he's a semantic realist without being an ontological realist as to ethics. So that's the typical view of ontological realism in ethics. Moral entities exist that are moral statements, truth makers. Whatever they are truth makers. So the naturalist thought that truth makers were natural properties. The supernaturalist thought there was goodness or something perhaps you can understand by intuition. Whatever. The point with these views was that moral statements are true or false because there are truth makers out there. Okay. This was interpreted in two ways. Famously, G. Moore said that moral entities are not natural because of the open question argument, right? Any natural properties you'd say, oh, this is what goodness is, you can ask, is this good really? This thing here, is it good? So you are applying the term goodness to judge what supposedly is goodness intrinsically. And this proves that goodness is never a natural property. It's always something that goes besides natural property. That's more form of realism. And then, like Richard Boyd, who actually was a student of Putnam, moral entities are natural properties that you find out a posteriori, looking in the world. This so gives an answer, because Moore is talking about a priori identification of natural properties and moral entities. This cannot be done, but if you look in the world and look for properties that are out there, and you find out a posteriori identity, like water is H2O. For Boyd, you can do the same for moral properties. They are natural properties. So these are two forms of realism, okay? Ontological realism. And then there is semantical realism, according to which moral statements are appropriately accessible for truth or falsity. As you know, many ethicists don't think so. All the sentimentalist or emotivist or tradition thinks that this is not the case. The tradition that comes from Hume, for example, right? They are not true or false. They are expressions of feelings or sentiments. So not everyone is a semantic realist. But if you're a semantic realist, you think that this is true. Okay, now let's go look at what is non-realism in ethics, because what happens here, I'm telling you why I'm doing this, to understand what Putnam's proposal is, because it's realist in ontology, but anti-realist in semantics. Sorry, it's anti-realist in ontology and realist in semantics, and this is something that was unheard before. So perhaps it's wrong, but first, let's try to see exactly how it fits in the debate. So, this is ontological non-realism. Now, moral entities exist to which moral statements refer. There are not moral properties out there. Simply for several reasons. One is that they are simply too strange, like too queer for the naturalistic philosopher. John Mackey had this idea, right? Moral properties are queer entities that we can't accept in our ontology. In 3 minutes, in 2 minutes, I'll show that Patton shares this view. Then semantical non-realism. Moral statements cannot be true, as I said, the Humean tradition, for example. Okay, these are the two, the different actually forms of semantical non-realism. There are the non-cognitivism. Moral statements cannot be true because they aren't truth apt. For example, people who think like Ayer, right? From Hume, Alfred Ayer. When I say something is good, I express simply a feeling or my own, sympathy for something that happens. But it's not a judgment, really. It's like saying, same thing. Okay? Nothing more than that. It's not cognitive. It's not a cognitive judgment. Okay? It's not a judgment. It's an expression or a feeling or a sentiment or an emotion. Okay? That's the idea. So emotivism and your Stevenson moral sentences express attitude. So if I like something or not, it's not really a judgment. But then there are the prescriptivists, like here. Moral sentences are universal imperatives. So do that. It's not a judgment, right? It's not something that is true or false. If I told Jovan, please give me a glass of water. That's not very. Give me a glass of water. This is an order. It's not true or false. And saying that something is good is exactly something that should be done. That's the idea. Okay? So it's not a description, it's a prescription. And this is...
That cannot be universal.
That
cannot be universal.
Yeah, it can be something that you should do, but it's not something that you describe. No, it's not a description, it's a prescription. Okay? So it can't be true or false. You can be inappropriate in asking, or appropriate, but it's not true or false, because you are not describing anything.
Sure.
And then there is expressivism like Blackburn and Gilbert. So something that moral sentences express evaluative attitudes. Again, that's a version of this, much more sophisticated. The best version of it, not cognitivism is here. So again, I have an attitude toward a situation that I appreciate or not, and when I say that something is morally good, I'm just appreciating it. Okay? But all these views have as a consequence that, they are not true or false. So it's not really true that torturing a child is bad. It's not bad, it's not good, it's not bad, it's nothing, because it's not a judgment about the world. It's a judgment about what I think, moral. Okay? And then there is cognitivism. That's interesting. Remember, look at this. That's Mackey, right? It's semantical non-realist, so torturing a child is true. It's morally wrong. This statement is not true. It's not true, but it's likely it were true. So moral statements are truth apt, but they can't be true since they purport to refer to non-existing entities. This is an error theory. What does it mean? It means that when I say that torturing a child is morally wrong, it's like I'm describing the world. I think I'm describing a fact. The fact that torturing a child is wrong. But there is no such a fact. Because if there was such a fact, Mikey says, it would mean that there are things like a goodness or badness out there. Where are they? They cannot be there. So look, this is interesting. So when we give moral statements, we pretend to say something about the world, like talking about witches, right? There are witches out there. I pretend to describe something, but I'm always saying something false. The same is here for Mackey. Okay? Mackey thinks that I pretend to say something about when I make moral statements, but actually I say something that has no reference in the world. So it's false, because it talks about things that do not exist. Okay? That's it. This is another, I think, consequence of honest, consistent form of scientific naturalism about the world. So, because he, pushes the idea that either something is a naturalistic or scientific entities or can't exist in any way. But it's interesting that Patton shares a part of this. Let's go step by step. He's a semantic realist. So he thinks that moral statements are not only truth apt, but they can also be true. Okay? It's not like Mackey, right? It's not that they're saying they are truth apt, like judgments about witches, but then they're always false. No, they can be true. And then he refuses ontological realism about moral property, specific moral property, because he says there are moral entities there. This is us. But we are not moral properties. We are not goodness. Mario, Jovan, Peter, these are entities that, we describe with these properties, but there are no special moral properties. That's a very tricky passage, actually. How you can say that these statements are true or false without referring to any specific moral statements and refusing reductionism. So he writes this way. Ethical statements are forms or reflection that are as fully governed by norms of truth and validity as any other form of cognitive activity, because reflection on how it is reasonable to act given the overall concerns of the ethic of life is subject to the same standards of fallibility of any other form of discourse. So his idea is, when we reason about morality, we can actually argue that torturing a child is wrong. We see children there that are moral entities, and we think that they shouldn't be tortured. So it's true that we can argue for this. We can refer to how life should be and all these things. But, it's true that it's morally wrong to torture children, but it's not true because there are special moral entities there. That is a crucial move. And now we should compare what he says with the positions we have already seen, Moore and Mackey. So G. Moore said the moral properties of goodness is simple, indefinable, cannot be defined, and non-natural. Okay, this is the way Moore conceived of moral entities. Mackey comes and actually agrees. If there were, in this sense agrees, if there were moral properties, they would be like this. But this is impossible. We are naturalists. We can't accept things. And so he writes, if there were objective values, then they would be entities or qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. How could things exist that are simple, indefinable, and non-natural? They can't exist. And it's interesting to say that Patton says something similar. I don't think he did it intentionally. I don't think he was noticing that it was so similar to Mackey. But I asked him, I showed him this passage. This passage, he said, oh yes, they're very similar, because ethics is not about sublime and intangible objects. Sublime and intangible is probably this one. Ethics does not presuppose something non-natural, something mysterious and sublime, standing invisibly behind the goodness of the persons, actions, situations in question. Okay? So, there cannot be special moral entities, moral properties, still, differently from Mackey. So he agrees with Moore in saying that moral statements can be true, and agrees with Mackey in saying that moral statements do not refer to any special property. But he disagrees with Moore because he doesn't think that these moral entities exist, and disagrees with Mackey, who refuses to say that moral statements can be true. So it's an original view. Is it consistent? That, I think, can be debated. It certainly is appealing prima facie, because it seems true. If you think it's let's be fair. I think it's true that torturing children is wrong, but I think it's also true that this is not wrong because there are moral properties out there. So it seems to say something, but certainly we have to reformulate the vocabulary of ontology in order to understand what this ontology and semantics, perhaps, in order to understand how this is true. It's not an easy task. So this is the summary. But Mackey and Patton think the idea of objective moral entities is absurd because they are naturalists in some way. Even Patton is a naturalist. However, for Mackey, thick ethical concepts such as cruel just are natural concepts. This is an important distinction, okay? So, thick is something that you can factor. So, if you have a moral concept like cruel, Mackey has this idea that's actually very common. You take the concept cruel and factorize it in two parts. One is descriptive of properties in the world. So let's say the set of all things that are cruel, or all situations that are cruel, and an evaluative or moral property that says this is bad. You can factorize this. Okay, that's the idea. And when we apply that's for Mackey. And when we apply to them the queer thin moral concepts such as wrong or bad, the product is always a false statement. So the idea is you have the set of cruel things in the world, and then you say, look, this is bad, assuming that badness is something out there. What happens is that this is false because there is no badness out there. This is how Mackey presents the situation. For Putnam, instead, the factorization of the descriptive and the prescriptive component. So, for example, cruelness and badness. Like cruel cannot be done, and moral statements can be true. What's the idea here? The idea is, how can you have something like the set of cruel things there to which you apply the description of the property badness? You don't have the set of the cruel things if you don't perceive that they are bad. The factorization cannot be done because there is not such a thing as cruel if cruelness is disconnected from the moral evaluation. So they always together. That's the point. What is cruelness if it's not perceived as something bad? It's not that, we see someone torturing someone else and then we say, this is bad. We perceive it as bad, intrinsically bad. For this reason, we call it cruel. It's not that we say, okay, this is cruel. Now let's see if it's good cruelty or bad cruelty. Doesn't happen. So I think that this is the most important point Putnam has raised in ethics. I think it's still undervalued. I think that this is a very important and precious idea. Now, summarizing. So there is this theoretical option, ontological realism. Moral entities exist, therefore ethical statements can be true. This is G. Moore, and this is Mackey. Ontological non-realism, cum anti-objectivism about semantics. Moral entities do not exist, therefore moral statements cannot be true. And then Putnam, who says objectivity in this is word, objectivity without objects. So the fact that statements can be true or false even if they don't have corresponding objects, special objects. So moral entities moral entities as special properties do not exist, but moral statements can still be true. And this is a quotation. Ethical claims are bona fide instances of assertoric discourse, formal reflection that are fully governed by norms of truth and validity as any other form of cognitive activity. I repeat this because it's very important. And I think it should be an agenda in metaethics to explain why this is possible. Because I agree that you can factorize so in some sense, cruelness contains badness, even if cruelness is something else, it's not a special thing. You don't need to perceive strange entities, moral entities to understand that something is cruel. It's something out there. We perceive situations as intrinsically bad. Okay, now do I have some more minutes for the last part? This is about ontology. I told you that Putnam has a personal fact with ontology. With ontology with a capital O, we have to distinguish here. It's not saying that you can have the ontology of quantum mechanics. You certainly can. But ontology with a capital O is a project that he doesn't agree with, and it's a big philosophical project. And in Ethics Without Ontology, Putnam has written as an obituary of ontology. Ontology, in his opinion, is a discipline that, according to him, makes us wandering in cloud cuckoo land. It's wrong. That's something we should forget about. And actually, Peter Benningswagen, in a non-sympathetic review, is right when he writes that the title of Ethics Without Ontology should be Everything Without Ontology. That's fair, because ontology is intended in that sense. So, with a capital O. Because, of course, Putnam thinks that there is some legitimate ontology, like an ontology of agents or physical bodies. These are forms of legitimate ontology. But the one big ontology, that's, in his opinion, doesn't work. So he has three charges against this philosophical project, the big ontology of the world, one ontology. And he thinks, you see, these three charges, we'll consider these three charges in turn. That's the last step. Then I promise I'm done. Hello. Okay. This is, first of all, Patram thinks that ontology, intended in this big sense, is presents to be absolute. The whole idea that the world dictates a unique true way of dividing the world into objects, situations, properties, perhaps events or whatever, is a piece of philosophical parochialism. But just that parochialism is and always has been behind the subject called ontology. Okay? This is a little controversial because if you look carefully, what he's talking about is talking about some kind of analytic ontology. I think he's happy with Aristotle's idea of describing different kinds of things in the world. What he doesn't want is the absoluteness of ontology. Perhaps analytic, or perhaps people like Meinong, these things he doesn't agree. But this is, I think, can misguide us. I don't think it's what Aristotle did was wrong for him. So it's just a peculiar project. But and also there is another point he's not clear about. Really, before understanding what he was saying, I had to understand this is complicated, but I think it's correct, and actually he recognizes it's correct. When he writes the phrase a unique true way of dividing a world into objects, situations, properties, he does not refer to the uniqueness of the traditional ontological monism. He's not defending dualism or pluralism here. That's not true. But he's defending to the idea that ontology with a capital O, look, whether monistic, dualistic, or pluralistic, has the constitutive goal of determining the eternal and unmodifiable real structure of the world. He has to tell us that one true theory of reality. So, for example, St. Thomas, right? Aquinas. Aquinas had this idea. I'm not sure about Aristotle, but Aquinas had this idea. Or Meinong had this idea. Perhaps, I don't know, perhaps Lewis had this idea. Somewhere Descartes had this idea. Somewhere monists, some other were dualists or pluralists. They had this idea of one true theory of reality. Okay? So it's not it's not attacking monism. Okay? Because, it's not attacking monism. It's attacking the idea that there is one description of reality. That's the ultimate description of reality. Incorrect. Okay, second argument. One is the absoluteness. So, it's not that you find these things in the text. It's difficult. Because Patram has this, it seems very clear. It's one of the analytic philosophers that seems clear. It seems clear, it's not clear. So, one has to dig to understand what he says. The second fallacy I think he attributes to the ontological project is this. One is that, there is one true story. There is not one true story. There are many true stories. But this ontology, in this sense, has another bad feature for Plato. There is something else wrong with ontology, and that is the idea that each and every instance of objectivity must be supported by objects. This is when he comes and says, mathematical and ethical statements can be true even if there are no special objects. Okay? And this is, let's call it this, the ontological fallacy. For any objective claim, there have to be entities that serve as the truth makers for that claim. He doesn't agree with that. That's perhaps more controversial. So, 5 plus 7 is 12, but there are no numbers or sets out there. So, it's true that 5 plus 7 equal 12 is true, but not because there are special mathematical entities out there. Let's use this example, okay? This is, but at the same time, I don't think he would be happy to be called a constructivist. So it's really a little tricky here. But before I've said enough about ethics in that respect, let's look at the third and more, perhaps at least very interesting, third charge he has against the idea of ontology. It thinks that the meaning of there is or exists can be, and frequently is, extended. And he mentions mereology, as we have discussed about mereology at the Institute. So the existence, the notion of existence of mereological sums. So if you have two balls here, how many objects do you have here? Two if you count in one way, but three if you also count the sum of the two. This is mereology. And he says there is no way of deciding if mereology is correct or not correct. It's a question of what question you ask. And so if you accept the idea that mereological sums exist, you're actually extending the sense of there is. That's what he says. Okay? Or, another example, when you go from quantifying over things to quantify over properties, perhaps also you are giving a different sense to exist. So whether something exists might be a matter of convention. You know, it's a convention, linguistic convention, if we accept mereological sums or not. It's not an ontological question. That's the point. Whether we accept mereological sums as existing, for example, is a matter of convention rather than an answer to a substantive question. Okay, that's his point. And so the existential quantifier and its ordinary language counterparts do not have a single absolutely precise use, but a whole family of uses. And here is the example. Quantification in first order and second order logic has really different senses of existing. Now, in the review I told you about, that appeared, I think, in the London Review of Books or the Times Literary Supplement, Van Inwagen is criticizing Putnam. He says, he thinks, Van Inwagen claims that there is a single fixed in advance meaning for there is. So he denies, that's the opposite of Putnam's, he defends, Van Inwagen defends the claim that Putnam attacks with an argument. He says, the fixed in advance meaning of there is a presupposition of any attempt to extend the meaning of any term by convention. Okay? So, to explain better, he says, one will contemplate extending the meaning of there is in such a way that, for example, there is applies to sums only if one believes that there is at least one sum for there is to apply to. So, you want to apply the term there is to mereological sums, you have to agree, think already that there is a mereological sum, and then you accept it. That's the idea. So, and this is the single fixed in advance meaning for there is, okay? And Van Inwagen takes it as a proof that Putnam, Van Inwagen can be harsh, says this view doesn't make any sense. And I think it's a little too harsh. So Van Inwagen seems to think that there is a pre-conventional sense of there is. There has to be presupposed if one wants to extend the meaning of there is. Okay, that's the point. However, I think there are two possible replies that Putnam could give. That's me, it's not him. Let's see. I would, if I was him, I would try this too. Okay, one is this. One does not need to assume that the mereological sum of, say, the Uffizi Gallery and the Faculty of Philosophy in Belgrade exists in order to contemplate the possibility of convention according to which such a sum exists. So what you are really contemplating is the possibility of a convention, not the existence of the sum. That's the prerequisite. Okay? I don't think really you have to assume that you are saying there is the mereological sum. Because you are treating it that way, the mereological sum, as something that is there already, not as a convention. Putnam wants to treat it as a convention. Okay? It's not out there. Also, the original pre-conventional fixed in advance sense of there is can change in the same way in which the original sense of meaning has changed since, say, Plagius, Cradulus. So, I mean, could be that you have, perhaps, a sense of there is that you apply, but this sense changes in time. It becomes richer. It's not the original one. It's not what we started with when we started reflection. Because this is what actually Van Inwagen says, right? He says, actually, here's one quotation. He says, there is a single fixed in advance meaning of what there is, that you there all the time, all the same. Van Inwagen has this idea. For example, he always has this idea that when you use philosophical terms, they only correspond to the same thing out there, even if they come from totally different conceptions. For example, about free will. I was at this conference. He had this idea. A compatibilist and a libertarian are really referring to the same freedom. All the audience said, come on, Peter. They're not referring to the same freedom, because these are really two different kinds of freedom. One is rooted in indeterminism. The other one is compatible or even requires determinism. They are two different things. One is concerns also the will, one only concerns actions, and so many other differences. So the idea was, there are two different ideas of what freedom is. And Berenwagen has this idea, no, they refer to the same thing out there. And the same is doing with this there is, right? There is, the notion of there is out there. I think it's a form of Platonism, actually, that I'm not very happy with. Anyway, I think that for Platonum, one could even accept the existence of mereological sum in some contexts and deny it in other contexts, depending what you are doing, right? I mean, if we are at a restaurant, tonight we go to a restaurant, there are 3 chairs, there are 4 people, it's not very useful to say, look, if the mereological sum will have another. No, we don't want to have another chair. You agree? We have a mereological pass, so I'm not sure. Because in case you sit on the 4th chair. So it depends where really you apply these conventions. This proves that they are conventional because they can't be applied all the time. And I think this shows that for Patram the meaning of there is not fixed once for all. That's a way of seeing it, right? Because it depends what you want to do with the there is linguistic item. Depends where you are, what you're doing. That's again an heritage of pragmatism. Depends what your interests are, the way you use the concepts and what they actually stand for. So his idea is that the meaning of exist does in fact give a new life to a very old philosophical idea. As someone probably will guess who I'm going to mention here, exist has many senses, and this is Aristotle. So it seems that, you know, what seems radically new is not so new. Actually, it's very old, much more than the view that Berenwagen is defending. Okay, thank you.